freedoms there. Yes, there are probably some mosques funded by Saudi Arabia, but sometimes people just, need the money to build a mosque. They get it from there, and then they do their own thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that if there's some Saudi money, it will inevitably, preach that line. But yes, I know and I've heard that there are mosques in which a very more, rigid interpretation of Islam is voiced, and that's a concern. That's a concern for, I think, for the Muslims in America who actually appreciate the freedom they find here. How we will change those things? Well, it is probably not possible to change people's religious schools right away. But even, I should say this, the fact that someone is from the Wahhabi tradition doesn't also mean that he's a radical. He will be made very conservative in his family, life and so on. But, as a human being, he can appreciate the political freedom he finds here. So we should not, even in that tradition, which is, yes, most dogmatic, I think it should have a role to exist in a free society. The question is, would they preach violence or would they preach really hatred, would they practice hate speech? And I know there are examples, and I know that U.S. is right to be concerned, but I can't give you a map of what is here and there in terms of the United States context.
Sunnis are majority.
The Sunni majority, of course. Mainstream Sunni majority is this, I think, as it is in the Muslim world. Whereas Wahhabi would be a small part of that, mainstream. Yes, sir.
You closed your comments by talking about one of the things that, and I agree with this, one of the things that's needed for a reformist view of Islam to take hold is greater inroads for the market economy. And you touched on this with the merchants that talk about how the Prophet Muhammad was a merchant. What are the different schools of thought within Islam on the compatibility of the market economy with Islam itself? Okay,
well, that's a great question. I spoke at Cato last week. It was exclusively about that. And actually, market economy has been appreciated by the mainstream Islamic community. There are some Islamic socialists which emerged in the 20th century mostly, which were heavily influenced by Marxism. And they were influenced by Marxism not simply for economic reasons, but by mostly because that Marxism and its theory of imperialism, had an anti-Western, like a line of thought, which played into the anti-colonial feelings of the Western, the Muslims in the Middle East. But I see that as a deviation from the Islamic norm, because private property, free trade, these have been the pillars of Islam from the earliest centuries. But I would say in the initial centuries, the difference between the Hanbalis and the Mu'tazila, the rationalists, was not just their theology, was also their profession. Most Mu'tazilites, as I mentioned in my book, were either merchants or artisans, again, which were engaged in trade and became more open-minded, whereas the Hanbalis and their supporters were landlords or the lower classes, which really were not exposed, which were more parochial in their way of thinking. So their profession had something to do. But generally, even in that tradition, when you look at Ibn Taymiyyah, who's radical on most issues, on property rights he would be quite, he would be solid, if you will. There is, of course, an idea of charity, an idea of benevolence to the poor. That's very much important in the Islamic world. So a ruthless capitalism, if you will, would not be probably acceptable from the Muslim point of view. But that is a charity done by civil means, by establishing foundations, by creating soup kitchens. That has been civil society based in the Islamic tradition. And it is only unfortunate that in the 20th century, the modern states in the Middle East overtook all those private foundations, centralized the economy, and thought that that was the better way to, really modern. And we still see that traces of that Arab socialism in Islamist thinking. But I think the argument for a free market in the Islamic context is actually easy to do, more easy to do when compared with some other issues. Yes, sir. Then we'll come in. Yeah.
You've talked mainly about reform within Islam. How will Islam relate to the other, the dhimmi, the Christians, the resort to violence, the acceptance of violence in dealing with people who are they're not apostates, they're not blasphemers, they're Christians.
Yeah, great question. In my book, I also deal very much about that topic. First, a few things. In classical Islamic law, there were, yes, considered as dhimmis, second-class citizens of Islamic states, which had rights, but which were not equal with Muslims. And I would say the situation of the dhimmi were worsened mostly by the dogmatic school that I'm speaking about. Like because the Mu'tazila school, that rational school, was more tolerant to the dhimmi because they were sharing, exchanging ideas. The more rigid schools actually worsened their status from within Islamic school. And I show how that happened in the medieval world. But here's an important thing. It is, some people in the West think that this is only what Islam offers to the world. I mean, Muslims will be the supreme and non-Muslims will be dhimmis. Well, they're missing that the Islamic Ottoman Empire, under the Caliphate, abolished the dhimmi status in the middle of the 19th century and made all Jews and Christians equal citizens of the Ottoman Empire. This happened in 1856 with an important edict in the Ottoman Empire. And that's why Jews, Armenians, and Greeks became equal citizens of the Ottoman Empire. They became statesmen, they became parliamentarians. In the Ottoman Parliament, which was opened in 1876, 1/3 of the parliament was non-Muslim. And Ottoman scholars, when they were, making this change, they argued Islamically. They said the dhimmi status was a temporal status which became permanent, but the state has the right to change that status because it was accepted in the Hanafi tradition that as time changes, laws should change as well. Today's radicals, like the diehard Islamists, trash that Ottoman experience, the first experience with modernity, and just want to go back to the early, sources, but the radical ones. I mean, the earliest sects. So, but actually, it shows that the history of Islamic world shows that that situation was changed and reformed. And finally, on the issue of, when you say violence, on the issue of terrorism, I would say from a Sharia-minded perspective, even from a classical Sharia-minded perspective, attacks against civilians are not acceptable. I mean, it's in classical Sharia books that in a war, non-combatants should not be harmed. And terrorists like Al-Qaeda, they find ways, very intricate ways to move beyond those rules. And they do something which is unacceptable even for the most conservative-minded mainstream thinking. For example, in medieval Islam, Islamic scholars, during the discussing about the rules of war, they did not allow, some of them did not allow using catapults to throw big stones to beach cities because they said that those stones would hurt women and children there as well, which you should not harm according to Islamic law. So terrorism, which is very extreme, is like totally denounceable even from a mainstream point of view. In the mainstream, there's a dhimmi idea, but that the Ottoman experience showed that was even reformed and equal citizenship was accepted by Muslims. Sir, you had one. Oh.
How do you personally view the increased publicity and popularity of Muslim comics or comedians that seem to be really catching on, at least in the United States? And I was curious, what is your knowledge of that throughout the world and in Muslim culture? Is that acceptable everywhere?
Do you mean the 99, that particular topic? Yeah. There's a comic called The 99
and I mean others too, yes.
Yeah. I'm sympathetic to those comic books. First of all, the Saudis denounce them. That's a reason to sympathize with them. Denounce them as un-Islamic. One reason. But the more, articulate reason, if you will, is this idea of superheroes is a very American phenomenon. Supermans and Batmans and so on. And I think that shows something about the role of the individual in the West, which I very much appreciate. I mean,
actually, I appreciate you talking about this, but I meant more the ones that are going for laughs, comedians.
Stand-up comedians, sorry. So, okay, comic books are good for that reason. Muslim Superman is a good thing, that shows that individual has something to do. If he's doing good things, and he's doing good things in those books, so that's fine. As for these stand-up comedians, it's great. I mean, we need more humor in the Muslim culture. And I've seen those stand-up comedians in Ireland. Well, I was on a book tour and they were there. Allah Made Me Funny. They're making fun of some of the really hard, rules in Islamic culture. They are Muslims. They're not making fun of God. That would be unacceptable to Muslims, including me. They're making fun of some elements in the culture, which is, and I think it's humor is always a good way to challenge an authoritarian regime or a culture. It really, opens up people's minds. So I'm very sympathetic to that movement. And in Turkey, we had a stand-up Muslim comedian woman as well, a woman who wear the headscarf, but made fun of various things in society. And I'm all sympathetic to those the dynamics. Yes, sir.
My question is about the Medina document. I think that could be raised up concerning non-Muslim-Muslim relations, and could it be used as a source of cosmopolitanism?
Great question. And actually that's in my book too, but great that you raised it up. It is interesting that when Prophet Muhammad founded a political entity in Medina the first time, in Mecca he was persecuted, but in Medina he became the head of the political community. He did not actually found an Islamic state, as I understand. He founded the city of Medina, in which Jews and Muslims were equal and two different communities. He signed a charter with the Jews in Medina, and this charter, the Medina document said, to Muslims their religion, to Jews their religion, but they will defend Medina together in the face of a attack from the outside. And some Muslim thinkers in the modern world, looking back at that document, say, here's an idea of actually a secular state under which different religious communities exist within a form of pluralism. And that really actually negates the example of the Islamists, the utopia of the Islamists, in which an Islamic state, because first of all, I don't believe there's something called an Islamic state, but their idea that states will impose Islam to everybody, whereas the Medina Charter of Prophet Muhammad in initial years accepted that Jews are actually equal and they have their own community and they can organize themselves accordingly.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. Please join us outside where Mustafa's book, Islam Without Extremes, is for sale. He'll be here signing books if you'd like to speak with him more, and there will be refreshments outside as well. Thank you for joining us today.